Good evening and welcome to What Climate Change Loss and Damage Means for the US and the World, an event hosted by the Phelan US Center at the London School of Economics. My name is Rebecca Elliott and I am an assistant professor of sociology at the LSE. This event is being held to coincide with COP26, the Global Environmental Summit, where world leaders and their negotiators are attempting to agree to terms that will keep the planet from reaching major climatic collapse, with the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But even if they are successful, a 1.5 degree warmer world is already a world facing substantial and unequally felt disruption. Indeed, the climate crisis has already raised sea levels, intensified floods, supercharged storms and wildfires, and made droughts and heat waves far worse in the United States and beyond. As a result, we have already realized an array of losses and damages due to climate change. As US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate John F. Kerry said at the LSE when he addressed us here last week, some of these impacts are already irreversible. Without dramatic action, they become unlivable. These encompass damages to infrastructure and homes, biodiversity loss, negative impacts on human health, and deaths attributable to air pollution and extreme heat and cold, as well as disconnection from histories and cultural resources, among other observed and projected harms. Some of the losses and damages we've seen already have happened quickly and dramatically, and others are taking shape more slowly over time. But they have been distributed unevenly and unequally, in many instances meaning that those who have historically contributed the least to global greenhouse gas emissions have already suffered tremendous harm while continuing to face the most urgent existential threats. So the big question we'll be exploring tonight, and another key question at the COP, is how should national and global leaders address the effects of human-induced climate change that can neither be avoided nor adapted to? And we have an illustrious panel with us tonight to inform our conversation, and I'll introduce each of them in a moment. But a byproduct of this event being scheduled to coincide with COP26 is that one of our panelists, Professor Salim Ul-Haq, has been called away to join the Bangladesh Prime Minister delegation and cannot join the conversation tonight. Professor Whyte will also have to leave us early due to other commitments to the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Of course, we thank them both for the important work that they're doing in these capacities, even as we regret missing the opportunity to chat at greater length with them tonight. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Professor Kyle Whyte, who I just told you a little bit about, is George Willis Pack Professor of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. His research addresses environmental justice, focusing on climate policy and Indigenous peoples, the ethics of cooperative relationships between Indigenous peoples and science organizations, and problems of Indigenous justice in public and academic discussions. He's an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and as I mentioned, serves on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Professor Ademola Oluborode Jegede is a professor of law at the University of Venda in South Africa. His research principally focuses on the interface of climate change and biodiversity loss with human rights of vulnerable populations. And Professor Emily Boyd is professor in sustainability science and director of Lund University Center for Sustainability Studies. She's a leading social scientist with a specialist focus on the interdisciplinary nexus of poverty, governance, and resilience in relation to global environmental change. For those Twitter users in the audience, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSE Climate Risks. This online event is being recorded and will hopefully be made available as a podcast, subject to no technical difficulties. And as usual, there will be a chance for you to put your questions to our panelists. To submit your questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be submitted to me and I will pose as many as possible to the speakers in the time that we have. Please let us know your name and where you're from. We're particularly keen to hear from our students, from our alumni and incoming students, so please let us know. So to begin, I've asked our panelists to provide some prefacing remarks to set the stage for our conversation tonight. And these revolve around kind of three big questions. The first is that I've asked each of them to tell us a bit more about their personal and research engagements with issues of loss and damage in their roles as scholars, activists, advisors, or really any other role. to tell us a little bit more about how they came to see this topic as an important one in their work related to climate change. The second question to each of them is what, in their view, are the key issues or challenges that should be on the table in discussions of loss and damage? And then finally, that big question for tonight, how should national and global leaders address the effects of human-induced climate change that can be neither avoided nor adapted to? And if we may, I'd like to turn first to Professor Whyte.
I appreciate it, Professor Elliott, and good to connect with you and your colleagues and with the panelists here. So I originally got into loss and damage work just as an Indigenous person that was extremely concerned about climate change. My own community, the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, which is an Anishinaabe people, we actually suffered forced relocation over 150 years ago and have since seen the dispossession of our land as well as threats from the oil industry. And so we've been enduring environmental injustices for many generations, and that affected our culture, our economy, our family life, our kinship structures. And so by the time I moved to our original homelands in Michigan, in the Great Lakes region, I was really excited about the chance to interact with many of the traditional plants and animals and ecosystems that come from our history and our origins. But at the time, we were finding out that actually it was becoming a lot harder to practice those economic and cultural and social and kinship and family traditions because of the rise in temperature in the Great Lakes region and the effects on precipitation, the effects on heat, the effects on water quality and water levels. And so this led me to try to take action to be able to empower Native people in the Great Lakes, but also in North America and globally to take action to prepare for climate change. And so I've worked with a number of tribes on their climate change planning processes. I've developed educational programs for tribal college, university students on climate change and how to take leadership in climate change. I've trained hundreds of climate scientists on how to collaborate with tribes and Indigenous people. And I've worked in a number of other policy and governmental functions tied to doing things in ways that will make it easier and more resourced for tribes to be able to take action to address climate change. But Native people, I mean, I'm just one example. We're some of the most adamant architects of the climate justice movement. I've been an author on the National Climate Assessment, and we collaborated with the Bureau of Indian Affairs to create a model that was tracking all the different climate change actions that Indigenous people were taking. And just within the US context, where there's several million Indigenous persons, there's well over 1,000 actions that Indigenous people are taking to address climate change. And in proportion to the rest of the US population, that's pretty intense actually. And that doesn't even count a lot of the resistance efforts to the fossil fuel sector. So it's also excluding a key area that many of us would describe as climate action. And so we've been addressing issues tied to loss and damage, but I think a lot of people don't understand what loss and damage really mean to us as Indigenous people. And this has a lot to do with what national governments need to do to support Indigenous efforts to take action to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Remember, from our perspective, it's not that there's a universal understanding of loss and damage, and then it gets applied to our particular situations. There's over 574 Native communities, tribal nations within the US context. And each of us has a very particular story with climate change. But for many of us, the story goes something like this. Our communities, our peoples have been engaged in climate science for generations. Our oldest traditions of political philosophy, of policy, of social organization were always tied to the importance of understanding how to be adaptive to the seasons. And so we exercise flexible governance mechanisms that were regional and continental in scope. And we took very seriously the importance of tracking seasonal change and as well as tracking long-term change, so something like climate change. But in the context that I work in, it's really the US settlement process that rapidly dispossesses us of our land. And they do that to make way for the industries that we know are now responsible for the increase of concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so we suffered pollution, the breakup of our families and kinship structures to make way for the very industries that we know have this heavy responsibility. And so we experienced then the anthropogenic climate change impacts of land dispossession, because that's a form of forced climate change or forced environmental change. It changes land cover and soil. It changes the location you live, right? My tribe moved over 1,000 miles, completely different set of ecosystems and habitats. And so we went through repeated environmental degradation, land dispossession, and then we were forced into boarding and residential schools that sought to strip us of that climate science knowledge that I was describing earlier. And so I was recently part of an author team that published a paper that you can find in Science that actually shows that it's also land dispossession that has put us in a more vulnerable position with the current climate change impacts. And so when we think of loss and damage, it's not just that we have discrete cultural practices and discrete economic practices. It's that we're in a 200 or more year process of trying to recover from having most of our land stolen from us, having our governance, our self-governance and management systems disrespected, and not having a huge role in regional and national planning processes. And so you can't uncouple loss and damage from our efforts to recover our self-determination and self-governance. And so for national governments, they need to expand the way in which free, prior, and informed consent works. They need to reevaluate and improve their nation-to-nation consultation policies, especially in nations that have yet to respect Indigenous people's sovereignty and nationhood. They need to recognize that any wealth that any nation has is based on the fact that they took the wealth that we had, whether it was wealth we valued in the same way or wealth we valued in different ways, the forests, the waterways, the landscapes, all of that has exponentially benefited the wealth of the current nation states. And so we're not actually asking for anything. What we are pointing out is that there's a history that affects the present that is yet to be honored. And when nations begin to work with us as partners and sovereigns and improve those processes of diplomacy, then we're moving in a direction where we will be able to be as prepared as possible for climate change, including being leaders in the just energy transition. And so on the one hand, nation states have a lot of work to do. But on the other hand, it's important to note that because Indigenous people are so energized to do something about climate change, if we're included and respected, we'll get to sustainability faster. If we're excluded, then what's being excluded is some of the most energetic and motivated people in the world to do something about climate change.
Thanks very much, Professor Whyte. Let's turn now to Professor Boyd.
Oh, straight to me. Okay. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thanks. Brilliant to have the chance to follow on from you, Kyle, as well. And thank you so much for that. I think that you've sort of summarized many of the critical issues here, and I'll try and build on that in a good way. So I'm Emily Boyd. I work at Luxus at Lund University, where I'm a director of this institute where we study and research and educate on sustainability. So I'm coming very much at this from a sustainability perspective. And I guess as a starting point, there's interesting intersections with what Kyle was saying, and that sustainability studies and science tries to really look at the interconnections between societal aspects and nature, very much focusing on also on trying to bring in relationships between vulnerability and resilience, and how we understand this, I guess, from a scientific perspective, how we measure it and how you govern it more broadly, these intersections. When it comes to sort of my entry point into loss and damage, I started off working on adaptation and trying to understand adaptation and the effects of adaptation coming into sort of critical discussions around sort of politics of adaptation and vulnerability and the limits to the discourse, started off very much around impacts of climate change and has evolved then into a much more critical understanding of the adaptation interventions may lead to maladaptations. There's a whole sort of politics of scale there. And again, linking in to what Kyle was saying about the sort of injustices, the resource issues, the land issues, the historical issues, and all of those sort of societal roots of vulnerability. That's really come much more up to the fore in terms of the, let's say, scientific discourse, if that's where I can contribute. So then that has evolved then more recently into this domain of loss and damage. So what do we do then when adaptation reaches its limits, whether these are biophysical limits or social limits? There's various perspectives on whether we should talk about limits at all, whether this is a constraining factor. But if we think then in terms of the failures to mitigate, which we clearly see, and the failures to think about adaptation in more holistic ways or provide the space, opportunity, or platform for adaptation to evolve in ways other than quite technocratic. So we're sort of failing on those is leading, in a sense, to loss and damage. So we're getting now effects that that potentially irreversible, as you say, Rebecca, but also disentangling what those are from the historical context and the exacerbating effects of existing vulnerabilities is quite complex. Nevertheless, this loss and damage has appeared, become part of the whole negotiation discourse and the Warsaw International Mechanism and so on, with work plans and ambitions. And I guess, again, some fairly narrow ways of defining it, so it's about averting and minimizing and addressing adverse impacts of climate change again. And there are sort of certain focus areas that are okay to engage with around migration and so on, sort of transfer of technologies and so on again. So I think there is, again, emerging a parallel is this sort of small L&D we talk about, which is the loss and damage in terms of the science of loss and damage. So that, again, is maybe in contrast or a reaction, again, to the kind of dominant framing of loss and damage. So there's some of us going down that route, and there's a whole bunch of people that are working on this really interesting work. Erin Roberts, Salim Hook, as you said, other people like Petra Schackhart and so on have all contributed, and we're building also on this work to look at the disproportionate effects of climate change and what this means in terms of small l, small d. What are the kind of non-economic losses and damages that we might see? So mapping those out to really trying to understand and document the extent of those. And that's something that has to be done in a sort of co-produced way, I think. But I think it's really important that we can learn lessons from other areas where things have been documented in a positive way to be able to create a meaning, but also a long-lived memory of what it is we are losing here potentially. And again, just back to Carl's points, there is not to say we're starting from point zero here and documenting things that have been lost, because obviously there are histories here of losses, and then there are processes that are going to merge here going forward, which maybe links into your question, Rebecca, about what comes up, what's going to happen, what's important is there are all sorts of processes already ongoing, processes of reconciliation, processes of building solidarity, a huge amount of mobilizing, which is really coming to the fore at this COP now in really new ways. And I think all of that together with the kind of really trying to understand what these losses look like, what they might look like into the future, what intergenerational injustices we're creating here, and how we're going to work with this, both on a political level, how we're going to finance this, and how we're going to ensure that the right people are at the table are the really critical issues here. And I still think we've got a long way to go when it comes to the negotiations and the form and the mandate of our international organizations. the way they work, and I guess still we're negotiating around economics, basically. We're negotiating around international relations and so on. And we're still trying to get these topics really at the core and to be taken seriously, I guess, to some extent. So this might actually come up through national processes and things that are happening and bubbling up from the bottom up. In Sweden, I can give an example, is that, we see losses and damages both in terms of, one example is the heat wave in 2018, the losses to farming communities and so on, and the associated effects on health, mental health, impacts on families and so on. The forest fires in the north of Sweden exacerbating existing challenges for indigenous communities, the Sami communities, both to their ecological systems, their reindeer herding systems, but also intersecting with land rights issues that are going on in a really big way. So I guess in every place, something is happening now relating to this. And every place there's some discussion about disproportionality in some way and intersectionality. So like I said, this might all come from the bottom up, pushing our international institutions in a direction to have to take this seriously. And I guess finally then we have to understand more about the measurement, what the measurement means, how do we measure these losses and damages in a good way, so we don't go down routes of just measuring in very, very narrow ways. Perhaps we can think about how we measure capabilities as a way to think about this. And then also the governing as the final, like how do we create the right institutions at the right scales to avoid loss and damage ultimately. Okay, so I'll leave it at that for now and come back in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Professor Boyd. And let's turn now to Professor Jegede.
Many thanks, Rebecca, for giving me the opportunity to participate in this event that I consider very useful, timely, couldn't have happened at a more auspicious time when we are having COPA 26. Yeah, I want to understand your question to be, I should limit myself to what I'm doing presently, or I should take the three questions as a whole at once?
It's entirely up to you.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, because I have some slides to share, so I'm thinking maybe if I'm allowed to do so, I can. Should I go ahead?
Please.
Many things. Yeah.
If you go to the slideshow.
Yeah, but it's just covering. It's covering it up.
Well, we can see them. That's great.
Yeah, that's the problem I'm having. It's covering the menu hub. Now, my name again is Ademola Jegede. I'm a professor of law at the University of Venda in South Africa. I think that has been said by Rebecca. University of Venda, for the purpose of those who don't know South Africa very well, I want to say is in the Limpopo province to the north of South Africa. It's a university that is strategically located there, one of historically disadvantaged universities, which is just only recently pulling its weight post-apartheid in South Africa. I teach there international human rights law, and of course I also teach environmental law. I have some of my students, in attendance in this course. I can see some of them already here, and I think they will benefit tremendously from the discussion. Now, I want to say that by my my interaction with loss and damages issue actually, date back to, I think, 2010 when I was doing my PhD at the University of Pretoria, where I examined the interface of climate change regulatory framework with rights of indigenous peoples, particularly in the context of land. And that incident took me to several locations where indigenous people were in South Africa, notably in the Northern Cape. So, and I have since that time maintained that relationship with them, and oftentimes, occasionally, I do go there to sort of, see how we can sort of empower these people, particularly in enriching their voices in participating in events and policy development that, affects them the most. So I have been working on that, and I've been interacting basically on that. So my area of research, like Rebecca Riley mentioned, is on the interface of climate change and biodiversity loss with the right of, these are vulnerable populations. Vulnerable populations are not limited to indigenous people in the context of my research. I've looked at, different sort of, vulnerable populations within that context of interface of climate change with their rights. And one of the things I also discovered in the course of my research, which is basically what I do, is that loss and damages are lived experience of vulnerable population, particularly in the context of Africa, a continent that is disproportionately, is disproportionately contributing to climate change, and of course, also having to bear its brunt due to limited adaptive, capacity, as well as, other socioeconomic factors, which are just as real. So, and I see this, is a daily lived experience of, this vulnerable population. It tells on their environment, it tells on nature, it affects indigenous people and local populations because their livelihood, largely and mostly depend on, these natural resources for survival. And the trajectory, or shall I say, the trend in relation to how loss and damages tell on these vulnerable populations are well evident in a number of researches that I've done, some of which I can share with us. I can share some of them with us. It has made me in one of the papers I've argued, demonstrating how indigenous people's land rights are implicated by climate change and how human rights approach can be used to address it. Because I discovered that one of the things that is often missing, or shall I say, one of the deficits that we have in the discourse is the deficit of rights language, which, as you and I know, only was able to successfully find its entrance to a Paris Agreement after a long and tedious journey of negotiations and of course involvement of non-state actors to ensure that that preambular provision in Paris Agreement is entrenched. So that deficit is so key, and particularly in the context of Africa, where it is not yet seen as a human rights issue. It's not yet seen as a human wrong issue. And I have argued in Climate Change Regulatory Framework, for instance, which is a book that was published in 2016, that this right approach is so key, particularly at the regional level, not only to conceptualize, these issues, but to sort of, also respond to the issues. And of course, I've also, in that context, argued elsewhere, looking at the system within the United Nations to argue the need for a right to a safe climate, which I think, there is a gravitation towards it. Although there is it doesn't exist in concrete terms, but I've made an argument that there is an overwhelming gravitation towards that trend, and that, getting to that level, crystallizing safe climate as a right, or concretizing safe climate as a right, will go a long way to ensure that some of these issues, inclusive of loss and damages, are well addressed, as seen from the perspectives that there are issues underlying this causation, and these issues must be addressed. And of course, I've also looked at various interventions that can help at the national level to unpack it. And in some of my writings, I've looked at how the concept of insurance can be used to kind of serve as adaptation measures to loss and damages issues. And I've also looked at how social security law, for instance, can be conceptualized and concretized to respond to issues of loss and damages suffered by indigenous people at a national level. I've looked at all those as part of my writing. Then I've also looked at how those issues can actually occasion loss of sacred sites, loss of means of livelihood, and which we at times push these vulnerable populations to displacement, involuntary displacement. So all these are the issues I've looked at within the limit of my research, and I find them very useful because they are also subjects in which we continue to engage with actors at various levels. I participated at the UN discussion in relation to climate change and human rights. I've made this submission there too. As far as Africa is concerned, I was also part of a negotiating team in Africa, the post 2020 biodiversity framework, which is still being discussed, and I've kind of drawn the attention to this intricate interface of climate change, biodiversity, with existing losses and irretrievable losses and damages being suffered by vulnerable populations in Africa. I don't know if I can stop there, to respond to other questions, or I should just go ahead and make all the presentation.
Why don't we pause there and have a bit of a conversation between the four of us, and see kind of what else comes out of the conversation.
Yeah, that's good. That's
great. Good. Thanks very much. If I could just kind of highlight some themes that seem to be cutting across a lot of the remarks that we've had thus far this evening. I think one of them is that we need to be thinking about loss and damage in a kind of broader historical and geographic context, that I think it can be very tempting to talk about climate change, loss and damage as though there's this thing, climate change, that just hits us and causes all these losses and damages, and really kind of thinking about the exceptional character of those losses and damages. But in fact, when we're talking about climate change, loss and damage, we're talking about certain kind of historical continuities and kind of longer legacies of colonialism, of extraction, of dispossession, that constitute vulnerability in ways that are relevant, to a conversation about loss and damage. And another theme that came out in all three of your remarks had to do with land. Really having to do with the kinds of connections that people have to the land, and the kind of differing levels of power that they have to kind of determine how that land is used. And so these are things that I kind of want to come back to with questions. But the first question I want to pose to the three of you is, given that this is an event sponsored by the Phelan US Center, let's talk about the US first, because I think with loss and damage, we can think about the US in kind of two big ways. One is that the US is itself a nation state that is facing loss and damage, and in its vulnerability to natural hazards of all kinds. But as your remarks have also pointed out, particularly Professor Whyte's remarks, the US is also a kind of an important historical agent in constituting vulnerability, in as the kind of largest historical emitter of greenhouse gases, played a big part in climate change and the kinds of losses and damages that we're seeing. And so how do we think about the US as both the kind of subject of loss and damage, but also as a global actor with potentially really important roles to play in determining how we respond to loss and damage? If it's all right, Professor Whyte, can we start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one way I'd like to address that question has to do with how, especially privileged people or political leaders within the US understand themselves as being in the position to respond to loss and damage. And I think within the US, you get some different types of memory that are operative. So for example, the United States, like you were saying, Professor Elliott, has caused anthropogenic climate change, both against its own people, but also has exported that type of violence all over the world. And so the United States, people in the position of authority to be able to do things about climate change, when they oftentimes think about loss and damage, they only think about the loss and damage that's tangible to them. So for example, tangible in relation to effects their own families and children might face in the future. Or if it's somebody in a policy position, they might think of something like, say, Hurricane Katrina or the recent flood issues that affected Black communities in Detroit more heavily than other communities. They only think of it in terms of the economic cost or the issues tied to infrastructure and housing. And so in this way, in the context of the US, there is a very short memory about what a lot of losses and damages are. And oftentimes people are promoting solutions that are barely even things that can be considered as Band-Aids. Now, one thing I'll mention quickly, though, is that one of the major climate change policies in the United States that's adopted by the Biden-Harris administration is actually an attempt to completely change this thinking. It's called the Justice 40 Initiative, and it's from Executive Order 14008. And what it says is that when the US engages in billions of dollars of infrastructure investments in areas like climate resilience infrastructure, energy infrastructure, water sanitation, clean water infrastructure, workforce development for climate change friendly industries and renewable energy, 40% of the benefits of those investments must flow to disadvantaged communities, Black communities, brown communities, indigenous communities, low-income communities. Now here the question is, what are the benefits? Is 40% a floor or a ceiling? And what are the different types of benefits? And so many environmental justice leaders have argued that benefits means things like community ownership of infrastructure, community-owned financial instruments that will be able to further empower the federal investments toward community development, and numerous other aspects. In a sense, making up for the last 200 years of infrastructure disinvestment and financial disinvestment in Black, brown, indigenous, and low-income communities. And so the Justice 40 Initiative has a lot of promise in terms of its ethos, but to actually implement it, the federal agencies aren't ready for it. And so there's a lot happening right now to try to figure out how the agencies could reorient, re-engineer themselves, rethink what they're doing. But we don't have a lot of time to do so because we're already facing the threat of another potential or congressional administration coming in that will be racist and against mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And so we're really trying to show that the Justice 40 initiative will make a difference in people's lives.
Thanks very much. Professor Boyd.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, fascinating to hear all of this from Kyle. And I guess I have more questions as well myself, but I guess it's really fascinating to see so much change happening so fast. I think that there's an awful lot of bottom-up action that's coming within the United States, but I guess that's been sort of bottling up for some time. And also there's like a window of opportunity, as you were saying, Carl, right now with the administration in place. And like you said, also that could change quite fast again. But it's really interesting to hear more that sort of notions of loss and damage as such are being discussed within the US, and that it has shifted perhaps. And I'd like to hear more on that from the way it was sort of originally framed, I guess, global North, global South, but that there's somehow a shift in the discourse here generally, that there are disproportionate effects from the impacts of climate change everywhere. And that as a result of that, people and places are, discussing and debating the effects of climate change, and those most vulnerable everywhere are affected. And that is a shift, I think, that has happened since the last IPCC for sure. And about time, I would say also. But I guess it's revealing that wealthier nations or more affluent places in the world are also struggling with these effects of climate change, and also struggling with the contentious politics around it. And that, I guess, the questions around that for me then are like, what are the opportunities that opens up generally, and where also more generally, like, where is that heading then? What does the kind of trajectory look like in terms of actually creating the human rights that Ademola is talking about, the dignity for all, and implementing some new real frameworks that are really getting to the roots, and also supporting and delivering to communities in new ways. Like you're just talking about sort of federal institutions having to like change quickly, but it's real and it's tangible. So I don't know, I guess it raises a lot of interesting thoughts for me. If either of you, Kyle or Ademola, would like to comment on that.
Yeah, let's turn to Professor Jegede for some response.
Yeah, many thanks. Do you really want my sincere view on your question? You want me to be sincere with you?
Sorry?
Do you really want me to be sincere in relation to the United States? You want me to
Yes, I mean, please be candid.
I'll be frank with you. As a person who has been researching on this subject for a long time now, I can say I've not been really impressed by the role of the United States, in terms of the leadership it is demonstrating in this important question. I can give you all sort of examples in relation to that. First, in relation to linking even human rights with climate change, if you've been following this story very well, the United States is one of the states who actually opposed that linkage, arguing that activities, underlying, climate change are the very activities that are necessary to realize rights. And of course, that kind of, has shaped his, policy to a large extent on that issue. I'm talking like somebody living outside the United States now, an African, kind of, giving an objective view of the participation of the United States in the discourse, which is, and I want you to get my submission in that wise. And of course, that in itself tell a lot. The United States also opposed, linking, bringing human rights, discourse under the aegis of UNFCCC. As far as United States is concerned, UNFCCC, it should be activities under UNFCCC should be totally divorced, from human rights. If you want to argue human rights, go to human rights treaty bodies. Don't bring that debate to UNFCCC. United States was also part of those who took leadership in making that submission, which stalled the progress of activism or activists trying to ensure that rights language are used in all these climate change instruments. I'm talking specifically about loss and damages. United States is also, particularly under President Trump populism, is so horrible then, because now at the time, there was even total breakdown of negotiation, total breakdown of involvement of the United States in the discussion. Even before that time, things were worse because, United States was saying then that they were, I think, along with New Zealand, if I'm not mistaken, they were the one making that case against African positions, saying that there should be compensation, there should be funding. The submission of the United States and New Zealand then was that, you cannot talk about compensation without talking about attribution. How do we determine the question of attribution? How do you determine which state, is responsible or liable for a particular loss and damages? So these are all the technical points being raised to kind of, derail the discourse in relation to climate change, and United States play a prominent role in leading this discourse, which I consider to be anti, loss and damages, intervention. So I think it's important that we look at United States in that context before so that we can properly articulate the role that we expect in nations, a nation as big and as impactful as United States to make in climate change discussion. I'm so pleased when I heard President Biden saying that they will start the leadership process. We're still waiting for it. So it's so important that we note that. And I feel that, except going back to what my colleague Emily said, except we begin to concretize all these issues of loss and damages using the language of right, we cannot adequately, address them, because if we just see loss and damages merely as loss and damages and we don't link to rights, what we are saying, it will have a knock-down effect on how we actually tackle it, because now it will affect the process, the institution, the responses of nations to it, because the way it is seen is not seen as a right issue. But if it is articulated as a right issue and people perceive it to be something that states should have obligations towards addressing, then becomes something else. So, and I feel that conceptual understanding of this issue is so important, even as we deal with it. We cannot, divorce our rights from it. I will stop at that now. Yeah.
Thanks very much. And if I could just kind of pick up on really sort of where you ended, because I think it connects to other comments that have been made already this evening about the problem of measurement. It's become a kind of technical question of how do we know loss and damage when we see it, both what counts as loss, what counts as damage, and then also to what extent do we attribute it to climate change. That's become a kind of technical question for social scientists and people who work in the kind of policy world. But I think your comments, Ademola, and Emily's and Kyle's really too, also speak to the politics of this, that there is something at stake politically in making those determinations, and the ways in which even perhaps the kind of fetishization of measurement precludes a more kind of political conversation about this issue in ways that might reference things like human rights. And so I'd be curious just to hear any of you kind of elaborate on that, how we need to be thinking critically about techniques of measurement of definition and how that might relate to the particular, solutions that then can get kind of put on the table to thinking about loss and damage.
Yeah, I appreciate the question and the previous exchange with the panelists. One of the reasons why the United States is able to play some of these violent games, both internally but also externally, about the assignment of causality and responsibility for climate change is that very short memory that people in the privileged population don't want to go beyond. For example, if you're looking at, say, a particular tribal nation and say that there's a potential threat to a cultural practice, well, is that particular threat something that can be attributed primarily to climate change or not? That's actually not that relevant of a question, because what we found in the National Climate Assessment, but also in a number of other tribal reports on climate change and tribal testimonies, is that the main reason why, say, a cultural practice is threatened is because for the last 150 years, the land base of that community has been shrunk. So there's only one place left to engage in that practice. And then something like coastal erosion or warming or change in forest cover or temperature, water quality poses an extreme threat to that. So the solution actually has to do with expanding back the tribal land base, with the US attempting to make up for generations of disinvestment and disrespect of tribal governance to shore up tribal governance. And I appreciate both panelists' reference of rights, rights to self-governance, rights to development, rights to free, prior, and informed consent, rights to territory. And so for this reason, right, climate change itself, if it's only looked at as something regarding a very isolated sense of causality, we're always going to get caught up in these numerical games. But instead, if we realize that some of the solutions, like solutions tied to rights, are ones that diverse people have been calling for generations due to repeated violations of their rights, land dispossession, educational mistreatment, cultural assimilation, then I think we don't need to get caught up in the various numbers games. But it's always, horrific to hear about the global footprint of the United States. And, it's sad that a country that has treated people internal to its borders has such a prominent position globally, because it's repeating the same practices elsewhere in the world and has been for some time.
Can I come in there, Rebecca? And just had a thought, and I was just wondering if there is a way for us to be able to use measurement in a way that can be to an advantage or usefulness. And I'm just wondering, there's ways to think about communicating through something like capabilities to other actors that aren't necessarily convinced of, the rights to development or the rights sitting at the core, because there's so many different perspectives and there's such strong voices, dominant voices in certain sectors. And as we were talking about earlier, the populism or those who aren't convinced even by climate change still. So I think a lot about, is there a way to use the measurement in a positive way? Is there a way to use a quantification to support people's rights or people's court cases? Is there a way to use this idea of attribution so take that which the scientists are developing and use it in a way that can be constructive for processes. And maybe I'm completely naive here, but I'm just wondering if there are ways to turn this around. It's just thoughts going through my head. So yeah, I'd love to hear from you all what you think about that as well.
Yeah, I think Rebecca, can I comment? I want to appreciate, the contributions of Professor Whyte and Professor, Emily on this important issue. Yeah, when I think about this whole thing, listening to you talking, which I'm so touched, because initially when this climate change came to surface, the issue was denial of climate change. So what we are beginning to also see now is also denial of loss and damages. We have some sector, like Emily was saying, dominant sector, with this messaging. I don't know if it is intended or otherwise, which is meant to kind of, distract our attention from the main issue. Now, all these issues of attribution, causations, they are legal issues, and they could be rightly raised. But as far as I'm concerned, what happens to principles? I mean, principles that we have, over the years, over the decades, have come to embrace within the context of environmental law. Principles that we have over the years embraced within the context of, international human rights law. Principles such as cooperation, for instance. Principles such as, common humanity of mankind. I mean, principles such as common heritage. And I think, there is a need for us to go back to this basic, because, if we see this issue in that lens, I'm talking about conceptually now, if we perceive it as this is an issue that requires a cooperation to address, emphasis will not be so much on who caused what or what caused what, which nation is responsible. Emphasis will be on capabilities. Capabilities, where does the capabilities lie? Emphasis will not be, okay, you are using, you are saying compensation, who is responsible, who is liable. This seems to me the very thing that was happening when genocide was happening in Rwanda, and the whole world was coordinating conferences all over the places, defining what is genocide, what is not genocide, is what is happening there. Genocide is, and before we knew what was happening, a whole generation is gone, where we're still trying to define what it is. So the same thing we are seeing here within the context of climate change discourse, when people talk about loss and damages, how to address it, issue of attribution, issue of compensation, liability, which get me right. I'm not saying I'm a lawyer and I know these are technical questions that we need to discuss. But how about rising? Emily was talking about messaging. How about rising beyond these technical challenges to actually embrace some principles that, have underlying, environmental law and human rights, and try to kind of raise the level of the debate above that to say, okay, now, how should we cooperate? Rather than say who is responsible, the question should be, how should we cooperate as a global village to address this issue? Because we can see there's an evidence of it. We can see that there are continents that lack capability and capacity to address it. As we speak, Africa is adversely affected. Low highland states, are being wiped away. Where they are making projections about whether the states will be in existence in 15 or 20 years' time. Those are the discussions that they are having. So they are not. So how about seeing, okay, how do we cooperate to solve these issues? How do we generate funds? How do those who have the capacity and capability, the technological capability, the wherewithal, how do we come together to ensure that these issues that confront us as mankind, how do we ensure that it is addressed? And so I think, messaging is so critical, like the previous speaker said. And when I talk about messaging, the content of the messaging is also very critical, that we place emphasis on issues that matter, on concepts that matter, rather than, getting derailed by technical issues, which, political leaders, for instance, would like to, stay on, because actually it prevents them from taking necessary actions. Because that's what I see. They keep discussing COP26 again. These issues will come up again. Issue of compensation. They have established all sorts of institutions. The Warsaw implementation mechanism. There is a what do you call it? The Santiago one. The Fiji one. All these mechanisms are here and there. They are not being operationalized. Why? They are not being operationalized because this political will is still not there. This messaging is still not right. People still see this thing as an African issue or a low highland issue or low highland state issue, not like it's an issue that is confronting our common interests as a whole, and in that context, develop how to adequately address it. So that would be my submission in that regard. I can speak more, but let me stop there.
Thanks very much. I want to make sure we leave some time for questions from you all in the audience. Unfortunately, Professor Whyte did have to jump off to respond to his kind of governmental responsibilities. But just to let you know, we have people in the audience tonight from the UK, from India, South Africa, Poland, Mozambique, Turkey, the Netherlands, Canada, Zimbabwe, Uganda, Singapore, Ethiopia, and China. So a truly international audience. And we'd love to hear from you. So do pop your questions into the chat. The first question we have, I think actually speaks to this point that we sort of just landed on about really the kinds of limitations of existing governance. And this question is from Ori Moulton Ulrich, who asks, how do panelists see existing governments with waning legitimacy and dependence upon moneyed special interests on top of party polarization, leading to them versus us, being able to change the status quo or business as usual? Are the panelists aware of the Global Citizens Assembly taking place in conjunction with COP26? If so, could such deliberative processes, critically at the national level, as they hold power to alter laws and policies and fund different things, be a pathway supporting governments to make real change with fairness and justice at its core? If not, are there alternative democratic improvements that you might suggest? So big question, a tough question, but a great question.
Do you want to go first, Ademola, or should I go?
You can go, Emily. You can go.
Yeah. Okay. So really good questions and big questions. Yeah, I'm aware of the citizen assemblies and obviously also the emergence of citizen assemblies quite broadly. I guess what I would say is that yeah, in principle, I think these are necessary and they are emerging for reasons because they're needed. The effectiveness of them is something that we'll have to study and evaluate and understand in a broader context of governance. I think your questions are really good because they're big questions. I think they're also questions that we don't necessarily have all the answers to. You know, what is the best form of governance or the most democratic form of governance? Certainly, democracy and engagement is really critical to solving climate change. That's without a doubt. And the pushback on populism and the emergence of, as we talked about a bit about earlier, the sort of the deniers of climate change still and other forces are very real. Also linked to misinformation and other things that are really going on and other governance questions that maybe are outside of our remit, but that are equally as important, you know. emergence of new technologies, digitalization, misinformation, and all of that, which is hugely important. So I think that I would look and study the citizen assemblies as a form of sort of democratic governance, localized governance. I would also say that we also need to be critical even of new forms of decentralized or localized governance, to what extent they are also co-opted, or to what extent they have limitations in terms of delivering, and not to put all our eggs in one basket again. That's really important here. So have sort of plural approaches. I'll leave it at that. And Ademola, I'll hand over to you. I saw you nodding a bit there, so maybe that's a good point for you to come in.
Many thanks, Emily. Thanks for the. Like you said, it's a very interesting question, and it's also very topical, because particularly when we look at how the climate change regulatory framework is framed internationally, it's state-based. Decisions are taken at the state level. Non-state actors only are restricted to sideshow talks like these, and lobbying outside the structure. And so for me, it is so pleasing that we begin to see such a forum, which I think extends democracy in terms of climate governance. For me, it's part of this what we call environmental deliberative democracy, which allows those who are affected by the issues to also have a say, and have a good say, for that matter, in what affects them. So, but like Emily said, it's also something that we need to kind of continue to critically reflect on, to ensure that the process is also not hijacked, to achieve certain specific purposes, which are actually anti-poor, vulnerable populations. Because at times when you look at these groups, it's welcoming to see all over the world, for instance, what is going on, why youth rising up, children taking matters to the Children Rights Committee to make a case, things happening in the United States. We still remember the Juliana case, but all these issues are so. Also the Uganda's case, and all these are the Irish case that is going that ended not so long ago. So all these matters are part of this environmental, deliberation, environmental, deliberacy that is going on. That, and I think is pro solution to climate change. But we need to continue to critically reflect on them, and to critically ensure that the process is not hijacked. And we also need to ensure that that this action is not only loud at the international level, that it is even louder at the national level, where it matters most. Because oftentimes, when like a COP now, a lot of activities are taking place. There's sideshow and that forum, that assembly going on, which is good. But we should encourage such things to also happen at the local level, at the national level, where it matters. For instance, when you look at climate litigation, for instance, in this part of the world, it's so few. Why? Because of the way people see it. People don't even agree on what constitutes climate litigation, how human rights can come to play. And yet you look at the international level, you see this activism there, taking place here and there. Then you wonder, okay, now how do we ensure that this is domesticated, which I also think is part of the solution we should continue to reflect on, because it is at the local and the national level where this thing matters most to those who are suffering under this loss and damage, so to speak. So thank you.
Thanks very much. As other questions are coming in, I also wanted to ask about, I think one way we talk about climate change loss and damage is that climate change is a source itself of loss and damage that we're worried about. But there's another maybe kind of frontier in which we might be looking at loss and damage, which is the loss and damage is attendant on the things that we do in the name of climate change. So, and perhaps this kind of connects to some of the work, Emily, that you've done on maladaptation. But this is, a quote from The Guardian today about how kind of mitigation and the strategies on the table for avoiding worsening effects of climate change could drive losses. So in this Guardian article, we have net zero targets, the central theme of COP26, revolve around incentivizing carbon capture markets through mass reforestation, biofuels, and new technologies, which many indigenous leaders see as false climate solutions that will lead to further land grabs and environmental and cultural destruction. For them, keeping fossil fuels and minerals in the ground is the only way to curtail global heating and its devastating impacts. And so I'd be curious to hear from you just how we might be thinking, or how we should perhaps think, or the things that we should be paying attention to as they relate to loss and damage, when it's not just a matter of kind of when the next hurricane is going to raise a city, or when the next drought is going to wipe out a harvest. It's also, the things that we're doing to try to facilitate an energy transition, or change our built environments, or whatever that might be, that could exacerbate some of the kinds of vulnerabilities to loss and damage that we've been talking about this evening.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Actually, we've been thinking about that at Luxus. My colleague and I and some of our PhD students are working together on that right now, looking at the relationship between negative emissions and loss and damage, because exactly that if we create actions that are going to delay tackling climate change, then that naturally might lead to increasing vulnerabilities and further loss and damage down the line. So I guess that's where we need to be critically aware and looking at the solutions that are coming through under mitigation. It's not enough just to say, oh, we're mitigating now, so it's all okay, but what are those solutions actually? So that whole stream of critical perspectives on geoengineering and negative emissions and so on needs to be then linked to us working on loss and damage and vulnerability. And then linking back also to adaptation, those examples of maladaptation, so investing in infrastructures that are supposed to help people to adapt, but actually have sort of downstream effects, negative consequences. Also creates further loss and damage. So these things are obviously interconnected. And I guess we're starting to make those connections in terms of the research community. Obviously, the journalists, they're ahead of the game when it comes to thinking about where things might connect. So that's also a good source of information and thinking about it. And so we're sort of mapping out each within our areas and then finding points at which those can connect. And I guess they're going to come through with perspectives to start with. And then I guess after that, there'll be theorizing and empirical work actually to follow on from that.
Thanks, Emily. It's so fascinating what you're doing. And, it's also very real, even within the context of, African continent. In some of my researches, which I have done, particularly in that book on climate change regulatory framework and indigenous land rights, and of course in other works too, I've actually demonstrated how projects such as, REDD+, which is being implemented, a lot of African states, I think close to 30 are involved in the implementation of that project, and how technically such projects have been channeled through which indigenous people's rights are actually denied. They are not properly compensated because they don't have the tradition, the conventional tenure system, which often underline contract, for instance. Their sense of ownership of land is so fluid and it's traditional. And since if you can get a document, a paper document showing you own the land, then it becomes very, difficult for you to even enter into that negotiation or that contracting space, between the state and, donor agencies. So you already can see that technically from the conceptualization and to the implementation of the project, they've been tactically, exempted from the scenario. So I can relate to the reality of such vulnerable populations when they say that it is affecting them, because it is not actually this program, which conventionally are meant to address climate change, are not doing so. They are actually reinforcing the pattern of discrimination, the pattern of impoverishment of indigenous people, which they've always cry against. For instance, in most part of Africa, what they do with Red Plus is just this colonial command and control issue. Just put a fence around the forest and send people who are traditionally living on it, or who have traditionally and if I may say harmoniously lived in that context, chase them out. So at the end of the day, the eco services that they rent, so some of them, that forest is an asset, is an access to their spirituality, is an access to their means of livelihood, just by one policy in the name of implementing projects such as RED, they are exempted out of it, and they can't access it again. So that is exactly what we're talking about, and why it is so important that we also conceptualize that in form of loss and damage, because these are loss of sacred site. If you cannot access your sacred sites, is in a way, loss and damage, because that's a non-economic one. So which is also real, it's so real. So I think these are important issues that we also need to include as part of the discussion, because they are real issues that technology, you're talking about geoengineering for mechanism, for instance, all those carbon capture, biofuel plantations here and there, jatropha plantations all over Africa. It's encouraging land grabbing. That's just the reality in Ethiopia. And it also raises further questions, particularly when you consider that this is a continent where food security is even, compromised. Then the whole idea of, planting just for people to use biofuel in their cars and all, then it also raises other moral questions about how ethical such is within the context of, continents such as Africa, where food security is a big challenge. Where people who feel it much don't even have a bicycle, let alone have a car to be fuel, and yet it is their land that is being used to make all this plantation. So this is key, and these are issues that I think should always be part of the discussion, to ensure that these measures taken to address climate change do not also, adversely impact the right of vulnerable population. Yeah.
Thanks very much. We have a question that's just come in that perhaps speaks to a very kind of specific site where precisely some of these issues might become lively. And Ademola, I might turn to you first on this one. Ionius Ndlovu asks, what are your opinions on the climate deal concluded between South Africa, the US, Canada, and other countries in terms of which funding will be provided to South Africa to invest in other energy sources and technologies and phase out its reliance on coal?
Thanks so much for that question. Professor Ndlovu, is a very lively question, because it's a question that is also very relevant within the context of Africa. It can be good, it can be bad. That arrangement entered into by between South Africa and these countries. First, because we do talk about the principle of common but differential responsibility under international environmental law. A common but differential responsibility suggests that states who have the capacity to help another state should be willing, which I think is a welcome development, because it's going to be positive towards, addressing and meeting the target set in Paris Agreement. At least it's going to contribute to it to ensure that fossil fuel combustion is stopped, not only in South Africa, in other states of Africa, states like Nigeria, states like where hot gas flaring is a daily experience of people in the Niger Delta area who cannot even fish in an environment where they have traditionally lived. So we cannot be glorifying fossil fuel combustion. We should welcome all the activities, all the assistance that we can get to ensure that such is addressed. And I want to see that contribution that agreement being made in that context. Of course, it's a loan. One can say it's a loan, it's the money being loaned, but then I don't think it operates under the conventional loan regime of high interest. So I see that as a positive. But then it can also be negative in the sense that we can say, okay, what then happens to all the coal infrastructures that are already in the systems, people working? Professor Whyte was talking about just transition the other time. So what happened to that transition? How do we ensure that those who are working in those sectors being phased out now? How do we ensure that they are accommodated? How do we ensure that their rights are protected? Talking about human rights again. So, and I think these are some of the areas where we need to also, shed the light of debate on to ensure that even as well intended as that thing is, to ensure that all these other issues are also factored in the implementation of the project. Otherwise, I see it as a positive development for the global climate system itself, because South Africa, as indeed with other nations, must ensure that they take steps to end, to close their fossil fuel sectors, to ensure that alternative energy source is developed, which I think is the direction that Europe is going, which I think is a beautiful one for the climate system. Because we can't continue to be emitting carbon and be talking climate change. Those are the things that are also underlying, loss and damage. And these are the arguments that people are making when they talk about attribution, causation, for instance. Africa itself is also causing it, in terms of future climate system. When we continue along that line of that, we continue along that historical path that we are condemning the North or following generation past. So if we continue in that path again, it's like we're furthering the circle, and we're not going to get out of it. So I think in that wise, how we say is a good development.
Thanks very much. We have just a few minutes left, and I want to kind of pose a final question, which is, on the mitigation side, I think there's a broadly shared sense that what would make COP26 successful is if we can get commitments that keep us to 1.5 degrees of warming. That would kind of mark a successful COP. On the question of loss and damage, what, in your view, would a successful COP accomplish? Are there kind of specific outcomes, or things that we, may not necessarily expect, if we're not terribly optimistic, but things that we would want that would signal kind of meaningful progress on issues of loss and damage at the COP this year?
Maybe I could just say a couple of things. I guess a real strong commitment to 1.5 degrees and NDCs, perhaps including loss and damage in policies and plans. So some kind of guidelines, or at least setting out what those kind of guidelines might look like and who should be addressing them. Putting loss and damage, I think it's been suggested by some groups to have a sort of permanent agenda item, and at Substan, I think that that might be something that could advance the topics. So, and then I guess advancing the Santiago network, operationalizing that and making that something real. So I guess these, and the financing aspect, which is really tough one and a difficult one. There's a new report out by Stockholm Environment Institute, colleagues there, on financing for loss and damage, which they did a good job of sort of summarizing the challenges around making financing a reality for L&D and the challenges of compensation and so on, as you're all aware of. But I guess just getting a few things more firmly sort of set in the agenda and discussed and agreed on, or for a plan, even if it's a plan to be developed. That also signals to all of us working on this area that it's of relevance and importance. We will continue to work on it nevertheless, because it's linked to so many aspects of vulnerability and development and adaptation and so on anyway. But just that signal is very useful in paving the way for important research, important collaborations internationally, and important work, building connections, collaboration, for example, as Ademola said, between, for example, legal experts and law and social vulnerability, resilient scholars, sustainability scholars, and so on, to also sort of push that agenda forward, I think. Yeah, so those are just a few of my thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you, Emily. I think you have covered the space so well. I have little to add. I just want to say in a nutshell that the system that is in place already, the system under, you've mentioned some of them, under the Warsaw implementation mechanism and the Fiji network, Santiago, they should operationalize this system. I mean, this system should not just be tiger on paper. They should take concrete steps, actionable steps that can be measured in terms of, okay, how our states, are complying with what these mechanisms, require, because those mechanisms look so fascinating on paper, but then when it comes to implementation, it's like we always discuss it at the next COP, nothing in between. So, and I don't think it's like kind of kid gloving these issues. So I feel the issue of implementation should be very fundamental at COP discussion. Then, when we look at the instruments of pillar instruments of climate change, particularly the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement, they talk about regional steps, national steps. I see that as often quiet at that level of discussion. Everything is just international, UN. There's a need to also begin to see how do we take regional steps. AU, for instance, how does AU take regional steps to ensure that issues pertaining to that continent, specifically the continent, are addressed? How does other regional blocks, how do they take measures? I think this should also be part of the submission at that level. We see people lobbying, AU lobbying, G77, everybody just lobbying for its own interest. But the question is, what do they do? What should be happening even at the regional and national level? And I think it is important that we kind of raise this discussion to accommodate all these layers of governance to make this issue of loss and damages more susceptible to being addressed at all layers. So I think that is so key that we include that we ensure that this discussion at that level captures all these levels, all these layers of governance of climate change within the context of loss and damage. Because whether we like it or not, we can talk about compensation, funding, and all that, where does the money come from, but everything still boils down to steps taken at the national level to ensure that these issues are addressed. And there should be a discussion around that too, even at COP level. There should be discussion at that level. The focus should not just be on United States. It should be a collective awareness that there is a need to take concrete steps at different layer of governance of climate change to address issues of loss and damages.
Thanks very much. That brings us to 7:30. It's been a terrific pleasure, such a privilege to have the opportunity to talk with and learn from our panelists this evening. Thank you so much for taking part, to everyone from all over the world who joined and submitted your questions. We're really grateful to you for finding the time to be with us today. And we've got a lot here to be thinking about as we watch the COP unfold over the next 10 days or so, and certainly far beyond that. So thanks very much, and hope to see you at future LSE events.